Welcome to our first inaugural event and to the second panel here, Surviving to Flourishing. My name is Mike Romano and I'm a partner with FESNAC. And for those of you who don't know about FESNAC, just a brief blurb on who we are. We're a regional CPA firm located in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. We're a diverse group of audit, accounting, tax, and consulting professionals, really offering a broad spectrum of business advice and guidance to our practical guidance and advice to our clients in the Philadelphia area and beyond. And I head the life science practice for the group. In the life science practice, we really focus on catering our solutions to the life science client base. And they really sort of run the gamut from compliance type services to, pertaining to audits of financial statements or compliance on the tax side, valuation services, and they have to do with business valuations or 409A valuations for options, valuations of intellectual property or early stage technology, obviously very relevant for the life science space. M&A work having to do with transaction advisory services on the M&A side or financial due diligence, and capital advisory services. So sometimes we advise on helping with a capital transaction, such like the first panel was talking about, and many times they could be of an angel nature or venture capital or private equity. So run the gamut of many services that we cater towards the industry. So I'm pleased to be here today to head up and moderate the second panel. So I'd like to outline our goals and objectives for the second panel and the flow of the program over the next hour or so, and take a moment to introduce our panelists to you. But first, the goal, so what we heard from the first panelist was about launching a life sciences company and raising your first round and some of the many challenges and issues that we're facing, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic region, with doing so. The goal of this panel, Surviving to Flourishing, is to really offer practical advice, guidance, and share some success stories, maybe hear about some pitfalls to avoid in order to help you, the entrepreneur, grow a successful life sciences company. All of us recognize the importance of understanding the likely path to commercialization for a life science company and understanding this rapidly changing environment in which we're operating today. This panel will focus on growing a life sciences company in the context of today's changing healthcare ecosystem. How does a company navigate in this environment? What kind of challenges and opportunities are there as a result of it? And we'll focus as well on product development. We'll talk about product development issues and challenges during the development stage once you've got some money and you're trying to move your product along to the next level. We'll also spend some time focusing on resourcing, insourcing versus outsourcing, when to hire, when not to hire, what types of resources to outsource versus you want in-house, and how to really build your infrastructure during this development stage of a life science company. We will frame the discussion over the next 30, 45 minutes or so from the perspective of a therapeutics company to be able to provide focus. Obviously, it's a broad spectrum with medical device and diagnostics. We're going to sort of frame the discussion from that of a therapeutics company. And we will also, much like Sanjay had mentioned in the first panel, we'll leave out of scope regulatory issues or compliance issues that could be a whole separate panel in and of themselves. Instead, like I said, focusing on operating issues, resourcing issues, and some of the issues facing the growing life science company today in today's rapidly changing environment. We would like to ask you to hold your question and answers to the end of the session. Like Sanjay's panel did, but please, in your program books, maybe make a note as we go along. If you have questions, we really would like to hear from you at the end and have a dynamic sort of discussion with our panelists to be able to hear your questions. So with that, I'd just like to take a few minutes to introduce my panelists. And first, immediately to my left, your right, is Jane Hollingsworth. So Jane, I'm sure many of you know, Jane in the industry, she's a managing partner of Militia Hill Ventures and executive chair of Immunome Incorporated, a cancer immunotherapeutics company. She's a serial entrepreneur, having started, grown, managed, and taken public 2 thriving biopharmaceutical companies in Auxilium and Newpath. And prior to this, she was a key senior management member of IBAH Inc., which was a multinational CRO. So Jane recently founded Militia Hill Ventures, which is a life sciences accelerator. It's an active investing venture model and helps to accelerate and support the growth of life science companies by surrounding them with management talent, resources, infrastructure, and the like to help them be successful. She's a lawyer by training, having started her career with Montgomery McCracken and Villanova grad, has much involvement in the community, involved with the Alliance of Women Entrepreneurs, sits on the board of the PA Bio, University City Science Center, and the Kimmel Center. So I'd like to welcome Jane to our panel. Thank you for being here this morning.
Mike, looking forward to it.
Immediately to her left is Jean Marie Markham. You're right. Jean Marie is founder, president, and CEO of ClinLogix. So ClinLogix is a multinational clinical research organization offering clinical research solutions to the pharma, biotech, and med device industries. Jean Marie is a nurse by training, having built her career as a strategic thinker and problem solver for the life sciences industry. And she has extensive experience in point of care, to clinical to commercial operations, having developed solutions from phase 1 to phase 4, from discovery to phase 4 in the life sciences industry. She's active in the community as well, on industry, serving on industry and community boards, to include the Alliance for Women Entrepreneurs, the DIA Clinical Ops Board member, and a mentor and member of the Healthcare Business Women's Associates. So Jean Marie is representing an organization that is providing outsourcing solutions to the industry, so she will bring a unique and interesting and balanced perspective to our panel discussions this morning. Thank you, Jean Marie, for joining us. And then immediately to her left, your far right on the panel here is Denny Wilson. So Denny is chairman and CEO of Hisiri Therapeutics. Having founded Hisiri just over a year ago, it's a startup developer of novel antibiotics based on discoveries coming out of the University of Notre Dame. Denny, also a lawyer by training, has a long pharmaceutical industry career, having started with Abbott Labs, and then he moved on to Roar, before co-founding Cytokine Pharma Sciences in 1992. So Denny was with Cytokine for 19 years, where he was president and CEO, before executing a successful sale to Ferring in October of 2011. Denny is also active in the community, sitting on various boards, including co-chair of the Hubert J.P. Shoemaker Classic, which many of you know is an annual golf classic and dinner in honor of Hubert Shoemaker, is supporting the Melmark organization. So welcome, Denny. Thank you for joining our board this morning.
Glad to be here.
So Sanjay started out, and he had some questions of the audience. I'd like to add to some of those questions to get a little bit more flavor for who we have in the room. So I think his first question was, how many of you have started or were part of an early or entrepreneur early stage company? And I thought the answer, I think, was somewhere around 70%, so a good representation in the room. One question I'd like to maybe by show of hands, how many of you are scientists or have a medical background by training? A good wow. Representative sample. How many commercial? And how many operations? Okay, a good cross-section of folks. Anyone in the room, how many of you have successfully developed a compound to market readiness? Okay, about a handful of folks. Anyone in the room had to kill a compound or a program? Much more.
Many more.
Many more of those, yeah.
Absolutely.
And how about outsourced providers to the industry or service providers? All right, great. So we've got a really good cross-section of folks in the room to hopefully facilitate a good discussion here. With that, let's launch into our program. So as I mentioned, the environment today is very different, and it's rapidly changing than it was 5 to 10 years ago. Life science companies and the broader healthcare ecosystem in which they operate, it's changing dramatically. Companies are having to rethink how they operate and how they engage, and simply more of the same will not do. So Jane, I'd like to start with you, pose this first question. Sort of with this as the backdrop, could you give us some ideas? What do you think needs to be done different? What advice or what anecdotes can you provide to the emerging life science company for things to consider and do differently with this backdrop, with this changing environment?
Well, that's a pretty wide open question.
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing is to be realistic and not to deny reality. Because there is a tendency that I've learned over time for all of us to see what we want to see and hear what we want to hear. So if you are facing the potential obstacles realistically, it's much easier to figure out how to overcome them. So there are regional obstacles, there are therapeutic obstacles, there are regulatory obstacles, there are practical economic obstacles, et cetera. Each one of these you really have to think about, and they continue to evolve. So the way we look at things now is starting at the market. I heard that from the first panel. Start at the end game, but also look at not necessarily the trends today, because we can figure that out, but what do we think it's going to be in 2 years or 3 years? And obviously we can't predict the future, but if you're really thoughtful about trying to figure out where things are going to go, you've got a better shot at being there. So 2 years from now, when you're raising your next round, or where you are trying to get your deal done, or whatever it is, you're positioned much better for what the world is at that point. So, for example, I'm now executive chairman of this cancer immunotherapy company. In the last year, cancer immunotherapy is just like gone crazy. It's exploded in a good way for companies that are in that space. But difficult to predict, but you could see also more and more therapies in the clinic using that approach. So the idea that that might happen if things went well, clearly that was a possibility. And so whether you get into something like that or not, you know, if you're looking forward, you can make those decisions. Conversely, if you see something that is a great idea, maybe great technology, maybe great in many ways, but if the industry isn't interested, which means that funders are not interested, it's probably not worth your time. So, you know, just live in the real world. That's my pearl. And it doesn't mean it's bad. Please don't, you know, what I can't stand is negativity. It's not negative, it's just being real and figuring out ways to overcome it. Whining, complaining, which we hear a lot about because, you know, there's been a shift, a big shift in our industry and what's working and what isn't working and how we have to do it. That's all it is. It's a shift, and which is, as much as anything else, an opportunity for those that are being realistic, as opposed to, God, we'll never be able to do this, the world's falling apart, which you do hear. So,
Denny?
I would just add to that the way that you become realistic is you talk to folks. And that means going out and talking to pharma companies, talking to potential investors, talking to VCs, talking to other scientists, et cetera. You don't know it all. You can't possibly know it all. And by this process of going out, presenting, talking, and listening, above all, you'll hone what it is you can do and can't do, and you come to a realistic position.
Jean Marie?
Yeah, I think it is all about having a good strategic plan. I mean, a lot of the clients that we see sometimes really at that point have not identified a clear pathway, you know, and as it was said before, you have to start with the end in mind and build your plan from that direction. And the plan does move a little bit. So, you know, again, to be able to be a bit of a soothsayer, to understand where things are going to be and sort of have a plan that's fairly fixed, but also moving towards a bit of a moving goal, you know, is the only way to success.
So I'm curious, there's an intersection that is being driven or forced that's occurring of payers and patients and, you know, the life science companies. A lot of times the past has been the life science companies have been outside of that and really developing the drugs and putting them into the market, and then, you know, hopefully doctors will prescribe and patients will take them. But that's key to what's really changing here. So maybe Denny, what do you know,
I think you're absolutely right on. I remember when I worked at Roar, we had a guy who was the head of business development. And he would say, his first question was always, is it good medicine? And that stuck in my head, and it was kind of my mantra for a while. But that now has changed. It obviously still has to be good medicine, but it's got to be efficient medicine. That, I think, at least in my career, is probably the thing that has changed most significantly. Don't dare to start to develop something before you've tested the idea that it can be reimbursed, and at what price. If you don't have an idea of that, you'll never get investors, and you'll fail.
So how soon is it that you need to be thinking about the concept of reimbursement? It sounds right out of the gate.
As soon as you have the concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you want money, you need to be thinking about that.
Yeah. I mean, the whole ecosystem is very different. I mean, you think about, we're in this business because the patient is at the center of it, and the patient is still the most important part of this. But what has changed all around that is now we have more participation and input from insurance companies. So, you can't produce a product that potentially can't be reimbursed. You need to have good scientific method, or as it was said before, you have to really identify today an unmet need. And now we have the duty to actually be able to document outcomes. Is this product not only efficient, but is it effective, and is there a cost savings for that? So there's a lot more information that's being required even earlier on, and a lot more regulatory stringency around that. So, it's becoming much more challenging, and you really have to keep in mind the entire ecosystem of what's and how that's going to impact your company as you move forward.
Yeah, and I hear smaller companies say, well, we don't have any money, how are we going to get this data? I went to try to raise capital, and they said I need all this data on reimbursement. I don't have any money, so how do I do it? And you can do it relatively cheaply, and it does matter, and it's effective. So first of all, you need to be talking to people. So people that are in that world of reimbursement and have been for a period of time, have contacts and know all these people. And you can call them up. You can do an informal market research, or you can do a semi-formal market research where you do pay actually very little and get external third-party support and validation of what you're doing. And call people in those insurance companies that are covering a lot of lives that are relevant to your kind of product. And you can get informal feedback, and you can record that, and you can create a little report. And it really doesn't take a lot of time or money, but it's valuable when you're going out to raise capital, and it's valuable to how you build your plan.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the costs of it. It's well known, obviously, it's been talked about quite a bit, the staggering cost of bringing a new drug to market. I think it's estimated something like in excess of $1 billion and over, let's say, around 12 plus years to bring a new drug to market. Danny, maybe you could take a crack at fielding this one initially. What suggestions, what ideas, alternatives do you have that you could suggest for the early stage life science company to maybe help alter or modify this trend? So ideas maybe of partnerships or collaborations, maybe risk-sharing models that you've seen that have worked to perhaps share the cost, drive down the cost, or actually maybe kill a product early before too much cost.
First, of course, it depends on the product that you're developing. There's some products, some programs that are not as expensive. Some are astronomically expensive. In the field we're working right now, antibiotics, it's not as expensive as it might be for a new anti-inflammatory, for example. But I think across all the fields, probably the best advice is to partner and risk share as early as you possibly can. And that might mean with another pharmaceutical company, it might mean even with another startup company where you can share services. It might mean with a CRO. There are a number of CROs now that will also provide services on the come in exchange, for example, for equity or some other rights. You need to go out and dig and find a way to make it happen. Inevitably, all the money that you need will not be available.
Jean Marie?
You do need to be scrappy. I mean, money is tight. And you really have to think out of the box to put the best resources in place. Again, a good plan that you have got to religiously follow and manage your money and manage the process to optimize, the direction that you're going in.
Do either or any of you see or, a trend or really envision that there'll be much greater collaboration amongst, let's say, the large pharma to jointly develop a product? You get issues of ownership, IP, there has been some models that are out there that, have been explored.
Well, I think we've all lived and seen where bench research at one time was obviously all in the academic centers. And that's sort of, back in the 60s, 70s, all became part of a vertical integration with SmithKline and big companies like that. But really the last 15 years in our industry, bench research has been jettisoned. And really it's now all up to all of us, these small startup companies that are really doing the bench work and the legwork for these companies now. And so, I think it behooves them to try to partner and pay attention to what we're doing in this field and trying to set up those licensing agreements. But, a lot of that legwork is now being done outside of big pharma. And it is up to, guys like you to.
I could give two examples that we faced recently. One was a proposed collaboration with one of the major pharmaceutical companies in one area that we're working. And it was with a small group within this major pharmaceutical company. We had arrived, we had agreed basically the business and development terms, but then it got turned over to their business development folks at headquarters. After about 6 weeks, we realized we just could not get a deal done with them. They wanted all the intellectual property rights that came from the collaboration, and since the collaboration was based upon our IP, we found that unacceptable. So that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme is with a Chinese CRO that's waiting for us to select a lead candidate for, we have a series of compounds for mycobacterial diseases, for TB, and in particular in this instance it's for one of them for TB. This CRO is willing to do literally all the work all the way through to approval in exchange for Asian rights, basically China, South Korea, Vietnam, et cetera, and they'll give us the data to use in the US. Now, TB is a really small market in the US, but those types of collaborative agreements, I had never seen anything like that before in my career. That's new. You've got to be open and looking for those types of things.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that everyone in the industry broadly, including universities, hospital systems, realizes that they can't go it alone, even if they did, except for Penn. So, it's really much more about working with each other, and that's really the most effective way to survive in the world as it continues to evolve. So whether you're a pharma company, whether you're a small company, whether you're a CRO, whether you're investors, any investors in that spectrum, there's a much greater openness to different kinds of collaborations and a much greater awareness that everybody's got to be working better together. So that's a good thing.
There are a lot of opportunities like that. We're actually working with a client that had a device where an Asian country, was interested in having this technology available to them, and they basically funded the entire company from the proof of concept all the way through, and in return they have obviously exclusive rights to that product within that region. So there certainly are those types of opportunities out there.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some good examples of different risk-sharing models.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit now about product development. Turn our attention to product development during this stage of, once you've got your product off the ground and your initial financing taken care of. talk about some of the challenges and issues facing companies today as they try and develop their products. Maybe Jean Marie, this first question you could take a crack at initially. I mean, everyone knows access to capital is pretty much ever present and one of the biggest challenges. But other than access to capital, what would you say is one of the #1 rate limiting factors during the preclinical or clinical development stage of a product?
I think it's identifying the right resources, looking at your company, and earlier, they talked about having the right management team and structure, but it's the rest of the resources that you need as well. I think there's a decision you have to make whether that's something that you're going to do in-house or whether those are things that you're going to outsource. Obviously it's all about the data. It's key. You have to have the right strategy and the right direction for that, but, the agencies require you to collect data in a validated database. Is that worth your, $500,000, $2 million of investment to own your own database to collect that data to report it, or is that something you should outsource? So I think, again, you have to kind of look at, what it is that you have, maybe what those gaps are. Again, have conversations with people to find out what's the best way, where to go and what to do. And certainly, we don't build companies to last so much anymore. We build companies to move products forward. Yeah. And, having the right resources at those different points in time, and your needs change as the product moves along. There's a different team that you need in a preclinical proof of concept stage, and it's a very different team when you move into first in human, and that changes as it moves further into phase 2 and on. And so you have to have that in mind, again, when you're looking at your team, you got to be scrappy, right? You want to keep the time and the talent, and you want to keep the information aligned, but there are those pieces that you can parse out that make sense.
I think with a small company, it's not a question of outsourcing. You outsource everything. The question is how you outsource it, and when you outsource it, and I think this is a mistake that a lot of small companies make. You still have to stay on top of it. You still have to stay involved. The squeaky wheel gets the grease applies when you're working with a CRO as well as a university investigator. You've got to be there. You've got to supervise or at least participate.
Mm-hmm.
Which means you need internal knowledge.
Amen.
Yes.
So when you think about what team you're keeping full-time and what team you outsource, it's a very small internal team, really until you get to a pretty good size in terms of your company spend. And piecing it together with the external resources, it's easier and easier to do that. There are more and more people at very experienced high levels who will help you and be invested in what you're doing, even though they're only spending maybe 4 hours a week on it, which is all you need. But you've got high-level talent and high-level investment into what you're doing. It's really great. That's one of the best things about the evolution of how we're doing this. So don't stop looking for the best talent for when you need it. And then you can put pieces in as you need them and not be paying for things that you don't need anymore.
Right. But as a company, you have to retain that talent and direction and ownership of it. You should never let it go. Trust but verify, don't you?
Indeed.
So who is involved on that small team? When you're developing a product development strategy, what roles or resources, disciplines do you want around the table? What has to be in-house on that team?
Nothing has to be in-house. To me, it's about the whole. So if I'm starting with me, I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, what I know, what I don't know. So I need to complement that with the right skills and resources depending on what it is that we're doing. So, if you start with Denny or start with Jean Marie, it's a little different. So you really just go with your starting point, and that's your core, because you're either going to do it or not do it with that, and then build out from there. I don't think there's any requirement.
Yeah, I guess I agree. I think I would perhaps just add that you do need a core of people who are absolutely committed to what you're doing, and you may commit them through equity or some other means. Equity is usually the best way, and those are the folks that are going to be doing the verifying. You can do
But
the
what do you
trust.
mean by core? What's the core?
Well, I think that the core, you need a business person and you need a scientist.
No, but I mean, are they full-time? Is that what you're saying? Or are you just saying?
I think you need a couple of folks full-time.
Okay.
Full-time in the sense that this is their principal activity, their principal commitment.
At what stage are they full-time when you say that?
Well, I've been at this for a year and a half, and I'm still not full-time in this series. So, I mean,
That's my point.
to Jane's point,
I'll never be full-time again. So, in any one thing, probably. I think that's an evolution. Well, I shouldn't say that. Never's a silly word to use. But I just think, the ability to do things in a different way should not be underestimated. And it doesn't mean you're not core, doesn't mean you're not committed, doesn't mean you don't have that equity incentive, which I think all those things are critically important. But in this one company we have now, we've got people that are spending in very little time, but care passionately about it and are totally invested. And they do have some equity, and they do have a little bit of cash comp, but not a lot. And it's just, it's about finding the right people that care about what you're doing, that like what it is, that feel like it's worth their time. And those that aren't committed, you can tell.
yeah, you find out quickly.
So we heard in the first panel, I forget, one of the panelists was saying, like, you have the business person, and that person does everything, and then the scientists that are really advancing the science. But, I mean, at what point maybe do you bring a business development person into the mix? Is there a time that's too soon or too late? Like,
I think you better be a business development person.
it's got to be that person running the company.
Well, and if you're the business person, I think also as the scientist. At least if you're one of these core people, you need to know how to talk to folks, not just other scientists, but other business people, investors, things like that.
You need to know what they're looking for. So even before you start, you've got to have that business development hat on. So you're starting at the market, right? So the market, who's your buyer? Your buyer is usually the bigger company. And so if you don't know what they're thinking and what they want and why they want it and what they need from you, you're kind of shooting in the dark.
Right. Another question around product development. Maybe, Danny, I'll float this one to you initially. When you set out to design that clinical program, beginning with the end in mind, so what critical questions do you need to ask yourself and your team? So questions around reimbursement, we've talked about that a little bit already, but product labeling or design, how do these questions guide the development of your clinical program? So,
Well, I think we touched on them, and I'm actually not the best qualified to address this. I would just say that you need to take into account how you're going to get paid for it. You need to take into account whether it really is an advance in the field that you're developing, and of course you need to take into account safety. So you look at, starting from the end again, you look at a product data sheet that you would like to see, and you work backwards from that. That's from just a dumb businessman.
Jane, you have any perspective to add?
I think what Denny said was brilliant.
Yeah. Great.
She's a reformed lawyer as well, so that's all she can say.
So I'm curious if any of you have a story that you can share, that you're able to share around where maybe you had a piece of data, some information that you had to kill a product or dramatically change the course or direction.
I've got kind of a strange, a funny one. When I first moved over to the business side, I was sent to Argentina, and one of the things that I did there with Abbott, I was a product manager. I was product manager for a product that's now on the market, Lupron, and it was being developed for prostate cancer, for stage D prostate cancer. I managed to secure an interview with the top urologist in Argentina. I was thrilled. And sat with him. He gave me almost an hour. We sat and we talked about the product. He became very excited about it. And of course, as the product manager, I was excited. And we finished the interview, and it occurred to me to ask one last question before I got up and left. I said, Doctor, does it matter to you that this is a daily sub-Q injection? And his face dropped. And he said, well, yeah, it certainly does matter. I couldn't use it. I said, for heaven's sakes, why could you not use it? This is a terminal disease. You're providing relief for these patients. He says, you don't understand. We don't tell the patients that they have terminal cancer. Now, that has changed. This was back in the 80s. That has since changed. But knowing the context in which you're developing something is extremely important, and sometimes your own cultural biases can lead you to the wrong conclusions.
Jean Marie, I imagine you must have seen some scenarios along the way with as many clinical trials as...
Yeah, I mean, we had worked with a small startup company that had a very promising HIV product, and great idea, great technology, didn't have a very strong management team, didn't have the scientific thought leadership that they needed to really drive it forward quick enough. And by the time those pieces got in place, unfortunately, there were other competitors in the market that had already sort of surpassed where this product would have been. So, you know, again, poor planning, poor organization, not the right team in place, really killed what could have been a very profitable and a very good product for a client. So,
Were they surprised?
they were a little surprised, but you know, again, you have to pay attention. You have to keep an eye on the market. You have to know who your competitors are, and they really were living in a little box and missing what was happening around them until it was too late. And millions of dollars later, of course. So.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of reprioritization of products in a portfolio because you're constantly monitoring the space, you're monitoring the competition, you're monitoring data, and sometimes it's not even your own data. In fact, often it's not even your own data. It changes the complexion of that therapeutic space, for example. I mean, at Auxilium early on, we were working on a testosterone gel, and that's when the data came out on the estrogen, the Wyeth product, Premarin, where, you know, it became, they had to stop that study, and it's female hormone replacement versus male hormone replacement, totally different things, totally different premise, totally everything. But from a PR perspective, it had a huge impact. Fortunately, it was short term, but on what we were doing, and who could predict that? We really didn't expect that level of reaction to what we were doing in that perspective. But I think one of the main things I've seen is that there's particularly as companies are younger, there's sometimes a reluctance to get the data because they're afraid what the data is going to tell them. And I need to raise money, so maybe I should raise money before I do this, or, and you know, I would just say never ever be afraid of the data. It's your friend, because if it's not going to be what you want it to be, it's much better to know sooner rather than later, or you can move on to the next thing, and reprioritize or do whatever. But keep pushing, and you know, if it comes back bad, you want it to come back bad for the right reasons, meaning it just didn't work, not because it was a poor design or whatever it was.
Exactly.
Yeah, during one of our preparatory calls, you said the data will tell the story, and I just thought that was a great one-liner. It's just
Follow
really
the data.
drives home the point.
Yep. That goes back to be careful about just seeing what you want to see and hearing what you want to hear.
Yeah.
I
Right.
tell my kids that's like,
Well, always as they get older, you get smarter.
what they don't want to see and hear is me.
So we've kind of moved around between product development and resourcing and outsourcing. We've got about, I think, maybe about 5 minutes or so before we transition to the Q&A, and I'll ask each of my panelists as well to sort of maybe give a highlight that they think is a key takeaway. But just a couple more questions before we do that. So Jean Marie, do you see a trend towards outcome-based pricing models in the industry, and what maybe examples can you point to?
I don't know, certainly I think it's inevitable. I mean, the agency is requiring more and more data for safety outcomes, for health outcomes. I mean, products really now have a duty to show that there's an effectiveness. Of course, that drives up cost. I mean, from a medical device perspective, I can remember a time when it would cost us maybe $300,000 in 3 months to get a 510K or a PMA approved, and now we're looking at 3 years and $3 and $4 million and up for the same type of product. And you know, there's a huge responsibility now on companies to have to collect that kind of data. So.
But on the side as the outsource provider, are you being asked to provide outsource-based?
Yeah, so in design study and doing follow-ups in a post-marketing space to do safety follow-ups on products, outcomes, more and more data, lots and lots of data.
And Denny or Jane, on the other side of the coin, are you engaging your outsource providers in that, with those types of pricing
I've not
models?
seen, at least not with a CRO, for example, I've not seen payment dependent upon outcomes. I think that you do see that sometimes with law firms and accounting firms, where if you have a busted deal, say you're going to do an IPO and it doesn't go through, then the service providers can take a haircut. But I haven't seen it in the clinical research area.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's as much practical as anything else, I think, and what the market's going to demand. So when we're designing studies that CROs will do for us, for example, you always have to build in that component of what you're going to need in the way of outcomes to sell it to the payers. And often the payer is the government these days, so you just have to build that in up front. And sometimes you make a decision, but you just have to know that you're making that decision, which is, we just want to get the data, get approval. We may not have what we need to get reimbursement, at least the kind of reimbursement that we want all over the place, but we're willing to do this because we can fund this, and we'll do it step by step. That's a perfectly legitimate approach, but you just have to know that's what you're doing going in.
So we've been talking a lot about resourcing. One group that's out there that I know we chatted a little bit about in one of our prep calls, but we really haven't talked yet this morning in the context of resourcing, is your board. Maybe, Jane, could you talk about your perspective of how to leverage the board as a resource?
Yeah, I think boards tend to be underutilized by companies. Sometimes they're just put together with people that aren't as expert as you would like. Sometimes they are perceived kind of as against us instead of with us. You know, can be an antagonistic relationship sometimes, but really, if you are thinking about it, if you're running a company, that board wants to help you because they're in it for a reason that's usually very positive. And so, what I've found is boards like to be asked to do certain things. So you have to think about your board strategically, and first of all, get people that can help you, that have networks, that have domain expertise, and that will work with you, but also aren't going to try to run the company for you. And my experience is the more you're informing them and working with them and open with them, the better the relationship is and the more help you get from them. So I just think use them, give them jobs, and boards like that because they want to be useful.
Denny, any stories that you can share?
Well, I completely agree, but there is an art to it. There's no question about it, because sometimes if you share too much, they get down in the weeds, and they do want to run the company instead of you. I think communication with your board members is absolutely essential, and by the way, on an individual basis, not just in the context of a group. But you learn as you go along that sometimes you can tell them too much.
And they're people, so people,
Yeah.
People are people.
yeah.
Okay, so one final question before we move, then we'll move to the Q&A section. So hopefully you've been taking notes and jotting some questions down. We'd love to hear from you in a minute. But so this could potentially be a sticky one or an interesting one, and that is, when does the CEO or founder of the company need to consider stepping aside to maybe another role in the company, and really the idea of bringing in some professional management? So interested in your perspectives on that.
Well, if it's a scientific founder, often that happens at the fundraising stage. So usually the investors are the ones that drive that. And those, when you're working with a scientific founder that is open to that and can handle that, those are the companies that are more likely to get funded. If they see danger or an inability to really grasp and embrace the phases of growth of the company, then it's not worth their time. So, it just depends on the situation, the company, who the core is, and what their expertise is and what you're lacking. I mean, it's a company-specific thing.
I think that point was made well earlier when, to be successful, you have to really know yourself. And at some point, you can become a barrier to your own success, I guess. And I think, people realizing that they're kind of in the way of progress.
I think there are horses for courses. There are people who do well in a startup. There are people who don't make the transition well into a publicly traded company because the roles really differ. If you do know yourself, you will transition into something else voluntarily. If you don't know yourself, it might be involuntarily.
Exactly.
Importance of getting some kind of concrete feedback on the reimbursability of the product early in the cycle. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on when you're very early, let's say you have a target product profile that you have a lot of confidence that you'll ultimately achieve, but you don't yet have clinical data. How do you get meaningful input on how reimbursable it is, and what kind of input, what level of specificity do you need to be persuasive with investors?
I think that's always the problem. You do have your target product profile. You let's say you do a market research, hire a market research firm, and they go to payers and they recite the target product profile to the payers. The payers say, oh yeah, I'd reimburse that in a heartbeat, and sure, you'll get 20% over existing products, et cetera, et cetera. What you have to do is continually feed back against that target product profile to make sure that nothing has changed, and inevitably it will change. So this is a reiterative process, but you got to start somewhere. And I think exactly as you're saying, that's where you start.
Yes.
Follow up the same question. Now, everybody is talking about doing reimbursement studies earlier in the game. As we do that earlier in the game, how do you forecast what the reimbursement will be 10 years down the line?
Well, you can forecast it, but a forecast is a forecast. So you don't know the answers, which is why you have to, what Denny just said, which is you have to update it from time to time. So if you've got 2-year-old market research data on reimbursement and you've evolved and progressed since then, and the world has evolved, you need to update it because at some point it's stale.
If it were easy, everybody'd be doing it.
Exactly.
Mr. Daly?
I wanted to ask the question is, how do you balance the risk of projecting going forward and being successful versus the opportunity cost if you just wait until all the answers are in place and you can move on to the next one? Because at this stage of the company, you constantly faced with that. If you're fast and nimble and you want to go forward, if you're contract manufacturing, you have to let people know 6 months ahead
very carefully.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, my view is,
hedging your bet.
it depends what you want.
Yeah.
So I know myself, when I go into something, I'm going to go. I'm going to build it. I'm not going to wait. I'm not, going to just say, I'm going to do this conservatively because I don't know if I'll be able to raise more money, or I don't know this, or I don't know that, or the other thing. I'm in it for a reason, which is to go. You run into obstacles along the way, but there is no rational reason not to just go, in my opinion. You're going to build a company or you're not. And you can linger. Some people, are comfortable in that. I'm not. There's a way to linger. You can get grants. You can get little bits of money from here, from there, and you can have a job doing that for years. And there are a lot of people doing that. And at the end of the day, you can really have something. But you just have to decide, what are you in it for? Why are you doing it, and what do you want to do? And if it's you starting it, you can make those decisions. And if it doesn't work, whichever way you choose, so be it. Then you figure it out.
I used to have a boss who would say, it's time to cut iron. So you take as many of the factors into account as you could. You'd analyze, you would crunch the numbers, but at some point, you have to decide. And I think depending upon the temperament of the individual, how much data you can absorb and how much uncertainty you can accept, you have to make your decision to move forward. But it's clear that you do have to decide at one point and go. When we licensed our product in my last company to Forrest, and it was, I guess it was probably about a year before the expected approval. We had licensed it to them right after we filed or right before we filed the NDA, rather. And one of the product managers had contacted us to ask all kinds of information. And I remember I made a rather naive comment that, gosh, you're really starting early. And she turned to me and she said, yeah, the best way to get fired at Forrest is to miss a launch date. And I thought, good thinking.
Steve?
Gene, it's you. You talked a little bit about board members, and just curious, privately held, emerging, on your way to flourishing, attracting board members. Can you touch on that a little bit?
So
Sure.
The question was, just if everyone couldn't hear it, was how do you go about attracting board members?
I think this goes to how you attract resources in general. You have to be out. You have to be talking to people, asking questions, collaborating, making sure that you are not just in your own little world, because it's very difficult to operate that way. A lot of people ask me that question, and when you're early and you're looking for funding, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, and that is a reality. But you go to your network first and use that network to try to build from there and broaden your network. I mean, there's no substitute for the network. And you'd be surprised, perhaps, there are a lot of people out there willing to help.
Except for audit committees.
There are a lot of people that aren't, too.
Question here?
I like to know, like the new field coming up in the medical food, and how the medical food get evaluated and marketed in general. Like, what's the time span?
For medical food?
Yeah, medical foods. The question is the time span or the difference in developing or marketing a medical food product versus a drug?
Well, typically that time's a little bit shorter, but the agency is starting to require more and more documentation, because the agency's whole effort is to really consolidate and have one process, whether it's device, biologic, pharmaceutical, whatever. So it just means more time and more money, really, to get approval. But their thinking is definitely more information and more data.
Okay. You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question around resourcing. You talked about core teams, and supposed to be no, set number of people you need, right? But a couple of you have mentioned that you kind of working part-time. Does that mean just simply paying yourself part-time? Because it's a full-time job, right?
Well, that's a point.
That's a great question.
Yeah, because my point is, when we talk about, part-time, there is no shortage of things that, require my attention. When you talk about, networking, having to meet people, I just want to find out how, if you're doing it part-time, I just want to know how you can do it, so I can do that too.
So for those of you who maybe can't hear the question, he's asking, we talked about maybe part-time, and so he's saying, how do you really accomplish going at it part-time? And does that mean you're just paying yourself part-time, or, when really everyone recognizes it's a full-time job? So the
Well,
gentleman, I guess, is
whatever it is, you have to like what you do, obviously, and it requires a lot of time and a lot of effort to build something from nothing. And in the beginning, and the beginning can be 6 months, can be 3 years, you're not going to get a lot of money out of it. It's just the reality. So even Third Rock Ventures, which is the darling of venture right now, their business model, what they are doing is they don't take business plans like normal venture. They create companies, and they spend years, this is the part that's probably not well understood, years sitting around, reading journals, research articles, flying all over the place, talking to people, building their networks, understanding what they want to do as a business, and then doing the research, the testing, all kinds of things, trying to figure out if this is a real business model that they can support before they even start anything. So the more work you put in up front, understanding what it is you're doing, what the market need is, and why you're doing it, and how you're going to do it, and really testing that thesis, the likelihood that you'll be more successful on the other end. But the problem is, who's got resources to do that? Keeping your day job while you're doing that, that's one thing that people have done historically. But at the end of the day, it's going to take a lot of time and effort before you see the payoff.
We have time for a couple more questions. Steve?
Jean Marie, how would you contrast funding a service organization, startup service organization, versus a company that has a potentially viable product? And how has that gone over the years?
How would I value it?
Well, how do you, there's a great difference in starting a service organization, which doesn't have a product but has people and services and contracts, as opposed to an organization that might have, a startup organization, that would have a potential product that would eventually go to the market.
So the question was, how do you contrast starting a service organization versus a product organization and the funding associated with it? And it was particularly asked to Jean Marie because she started and has been running for some time now. I'm assuming that's why you put the question to Jean Marie, her service organization.
Because we have two types of organizations on the panel.
Yeah.
We have a service organization that relied on people and contracts, as opposed to an organization, company, that had a product that they were trying to bring to the market and eventually transition to sale on a larger.
Yeah. In my view, it's one and the same, because a company might actually have a product they can touch and feel. We're a service provider, but that actually is still a product. The services that we are providing to clients is a product. So the same challenges in building a business and funding a business still exist. It's a little more challenging from a service perspective because people say there's nothing really tangible really about what you do. But actually there is to some extent, especially in our business. Processes become proprietary, networks become proprietary, contracts sometimes, long-term contracts, then there's value to those. I think it's a little more challenging in a service-oriented because you have to be a little more of a chameleon and learn to work a lot of different ways to meet the same objective, where a product company, it's your product, that's the direction, and you can go. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, early in my career, I was one of the earlier CROs in the 80s, which is interesting, only 4 of us. And then I transitioned to the pharmaceutical industry and recently retired from a major pharmaceutical company. So I've watched the growth of CROs over the years to the point where
Crazy.
they became major companies themselves and have been sold to other companies. So there's an exit strategy sometimes in CROs where there wasn't early on. And it's almost like an exit strategy for some of these small companies that have sold to larger companies. I was curious to kind of bring that up and
Yeah.
share that with the audience as
Yep.
to perspective of the CRO versus perspective of the
I think in any company you have to have an exit strategy, and yes, I mean, certainly CROs have been a hot topic, if you will, in our industry lately, so hopefully that'll be for us too, so.
So maybe I have time for one more last question up in the corner.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing your wisdom with us. My question, I was just at the Mayo Clinic Center organization, and they have half their staff is practitioners, and half of the staff now are project managers. So we talked about CROs, but what about project managers as being a key component of the management team in this?
So did everyone hear the question? It was, the gentleman said he spent some time at the Mayo Clinic where there's a lot of scientists and practitioners, but also some project managers, and how the project management discipline is or is not a key or core member of the team.
I mean, I may have the title of CEO, but I'm a project manager. I mean, I think when you're in a startup company, you really are just a project manager. If you've got more than that on your plate, you probably should get somebody else, I guess.
But I would agree. I mean, you certainly set a vision for the company and a goal, but it is all about execution. It's about managing that project, managing the process, managing your assets, your board, the money, all of those things. So, yeah, project manager is a key, whatever hat that is, but a project manager is certainly key to execution, to driving the business forward.
Okay, so thanks. So we've covered a lot of ground, obviously, with starting with the macro environment and talking about developing your product and how to resource. So I'd like to, before we turn it over to break, just ask the panelists to just wrap up. Maybe each one of you take a shot at maybe one key highlight or summary point takeaway for the audience. Denny, you want to start?
Yeah, I'd say just talk to as many people as you possibly can in companies, investors, other folks in the field. Don't be afraid, as Jane says, don't be afraid of the data. I would say don't be afraid of the feedback that you get from these folks. They're usually disinterested. I would hope that the feedback would be honest, and if you listen to it, it will help you to pick the correct direction, and just as importantly, to hone your message going forward.
Jean Marie?
I would sort of mirror that and just add on again, you know, the importance of having a good plan, good strategy, and key is execution. So having the right team and the right people to help you move the ball forward.
Jane?
I would just say, once you decide to do something, you have to be all in. So tiptoeing along and saying, well, if this happens, I'll take the next step. If that happens, I'll take the next step. I just don't think, I haven't seen that work really, particularly. So this is, it requires a lot of determination, a lot of passion, a lot of work, a lot of collaboration, a lot of things. And it doesn't guarantee success if you're all in, but it certainly gives you a much better shot.
And then one thing that I'll add that I heard that sort of works certainly for Fesnac's business model is to outsource. Outsource as much as you can. So outsource early, outsource often. No, but with that, I'd like to thank the panelists. Thank you very much for your time and
Thank you, Mike.
participation this morning. We're going to